first question in from Carl in Ipswich is via text. Is there any excuse for not involving Ukraine in peace talks about Ukraine? Kate Fall, you're the daughter of a former ambassador to the USSR. Let me come to you on this.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, look, it definitely did feel uncomfortable seeing the Russians around the table, sitting there with the Americans today without Europe, without Ukraine, who have had such loss of life from that dreadful war. The one thing I would say is I hope it's the beginning of a conversation towards peace. I hope that Europe and Ukraine will be involved with that peace. And I hope that this is the beginning of something positive rather than negative. But look, we all looked on that with anxiety, thinking, where was Europe there? The comments at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend didn't help. A bit of an attack on sort of European values and an ask for us to step up. But there's an opportunity there too for Britain, I think. We can step up. We are both Europeans. We have a close relationship with America. Let's see us play a leadership role. So something that I'd like to see from the Prime Minister.
Do you not think that, I mean, the US State Department has said that this is very much an inception of talks. Do you not think it makes sense? I mean, you've advised a former Prime Minister, David Cameron. You can't start negotiations with a bunch of people in the room, can you? I mean, you've got to get something going before you invite other people in.
Okay, look, it made sense that they wanted to sit there and say to the Russians, are you serious about looking for peace? And it looked like those meetings were difficult. Russia has not been around the table for years for obvious reasons. But I do think it didn't help that the Americans threw up a lot of stuff heading into that. Lots of different statements, some of them walked back, but it just confused everyone and made everyone very nervous. And I do think, look, at the end of the day, the Russians invaded Ukraine. They've been fighting for their lives and their country for the last nearly 3 years. And it is disrespectful not to at least say to them in advance, we're going to sit down with the Russians first and then we're going to bring you in.
Daniel Kibberty.
Is there any excuse for not involving Ukraine in peace talks about Ukraine? I think not. They should absolutely be involved in the peace settlement following what's been 3 years of hell for them. It's been a completely horrific time. But what is at play here? I think Donald Trump is establishing his world order in which he wants a settlement to the Ukraine war because he views it as a drain on the resource of the United States. He said very clearly that he was going to reach a settlement with Russia, and he also views NATO as a drain on the resource of the United States. Hence, he's now insisting that Europe pay their way, as he puts it. I think he wants to focus on China. He views them as the big competitor, and that's really what's going on at the moment.
So it's fair enough, isn't it? If he made it clear, J.D. Vance, when he was a senator last year at the Munich Security Conference, made it very clear that the future is going to be, the focus is going to be on China, not on European security, and the Europeans have to step up. The warning was given before.
Well, I think the greatest threat to our security as Britain, to be honest, it has been austerity. It's been the defunding of public services over a significant period of time. I'm opposed to that sort of militarism, actually. And, we've seen Starmer talking about boots on the ground and so on. I think that's a mistake. We need to be focusing our investment in Britain.
So you're opposed to militarism?
There has been an escalation towards China, particularly. There is the number one priority of a government is to defend its people. But this talk of Russia as a threat to Britain, I'm not so sure. I think some of our threats are at home.
Okay, thank you. Daisy Cooper.
Is there any excuse to exclude Ukraine? Absolutely not. It's absolutely outrageous that President Trump is sitting down with President Putin and trying to carve up a deal without Ukraine being front and centre. They absolutely should have been there, and so should Europe and the UK as well.
What's Europe got to offer in this discussion?
Well, I think Europe has been invaded by President Putin, right? Because there's war in Europe.
They can't even decide about peacekeeping troops amongst themselves after a session on Monday at the Elysee. What can they do? Where is Europe in this? Why should Europe even be there?
Well, I hope that Europe will act quickly and come together on a number of fronts. Now, for the best part of a year, we Liberal Democrats have been calling on the last government and then this one to show leadership by convening a meeting of European leaders to make sure that we could use the 20-odd billion pounds of frozen Russian assets to use that money to free it up to actually give to Ukraine to help them finish the war and to boot Russia out. That's one of the things that European leaders could agree to.
But 20 billion quid is going to make a blind bit of difference to this war?
I absolutely think it could make a big difference, and we think that that's something that the government should have been showing some leadership on.
We're talking about hundreds of billions already spent, hundreds of billions, and there's a frozen conflict effectively where parts of the territory are being held by Russia, some is being held by Ukraine, of course, in Kursk. But genuinely you think that the frozen assets are going to unlock this?
I think it's one thing that could happen. I think Liberal Democrats have been calling for that for a year. We also set out in our manifesto, and we repeat it now, that we think we should get to 2.5% of defence spending by the end of this Parliament. We do think that there is conversations to be had about whether there are boots on the ground and a peacekeeping force. And our party leader Ed Davey has said that we back those calls by the Prime Minister. So those are three examples of things that we could be doing.
Okay, it's interesting. 2.5%, it might be all a fig leaf, frankly. Some people are talking about 5, including President Trump. Liam Halligan, you spent time in Moscow. You also wrote for a Moscow-based newspaper. You've got a perspective. What is it?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in indeed Russia and Ukraine over many years as a foreign correspondent. Look, I think it's galling for the Western world. It's galling for Europe. It's galling for people who have supported Ukraine during this conflagration. But look, the most important headline here for people listening at home isn't the process and the politics of it and Western diplomats, European diplomats feeling their noses have been put out of joint. The most important thing is that this may be the beginning of the end of the most serious military conflagration on the European mainland since the Second World War, in which over 1 million people have died on both sides. I think that's worth saying, including tens of thousands of citizens. So that's the headline. We've immediately gone into process and what it means for various superannuated civil servants in Brussels, and I think that's actually quite tasteless. Look, of course, it's wrong that the Russians invaded Ukraine back in early 2022. Of course, that's wrong. Of course, that was absolutely outrageous. The reality is, though, is there's no way Ukraine is going to beat Russia. That was never on a possibility.
So why did politicians lie about it?
And anybody who ever thought that could happen knows nothing about the region and even less about military
Why do you think
history.
they did, Liam?
Having said that, when we see in Riyadh, it's a kind of Yalta redux for history's students of history. When we look at what's going on in Saudi, it is pretty galling to see the Russians and the Americans sitting down adieu, because it shows that Western sanctions on Russia haven't worked. The isolation that we tried to impose on Russia hasn't worked. A lot of the rest of the world thinks that the Russians had a point and do have a point. Russia's been growing by 3 or 4% over the last couple of years when Western Europe has been stagnating. This is just real politique, I'm afraid. What really worries me here is that the way the Trump administration is handling this, not necessarily that the Ukrainians weren't there at the beginning. Look, Zelenskyy was invited to come soon after the beginning, and now he's not going.
He doesn't want to be seen to be endorsing it.
I mean, okay, is he a serious politician or not?
But what an insult, though. What an insult to be invited as an afterthought to a conversation about the future of your own country. That was always the negotiating
schedule, Daisy. That was always the negotiating...
But the Americans should
Can I finish my point?
You finish your point.
That was always the negotiating schedule, and everybody is trying to save face, of course, because lives have been lost. What really worries me, though, is that what's at stake here with the way the Trump administration is approaching this. I agree with Kate Fall on this point. What's at stake here is actually the integrity of NATO. And while it's very, very important that this ghastly military disaster on the European mainland could soon be coming to an end, fingers and toes crossed. What's also very, very worrying is that the NATO alliance, upon which Western European peace depends more broadly, could be severely weakened.
Okay, Daisy.
Well, I agree on that final point. NATO absolutely has to stay intact, but the point on which I disagree is that this was still scheduled, and that's somehow okay. I do personally think it is an insult.
It was scheduled.
I do think, whether it was scheduled or not, my point is I think it is an insult that Zelenskyy was invited after conversations had started. Ukraine and Zelenskyy should have been front and centre from the get-go.
So, I would say, first of all, I think the Americans should have indicated that they were going to bring in Zelenskyy afterwards as a matter of respect, and I completely agree with Daisy on that point. I also agree, let's remember about the lives lost. My biggest concern is that we try and solve a peace that has no longevity because the Russians just simply, remilitarize. They're already, the economy of Russia now is very militarized, rather like the Cold War. And then they come back and take another bite like they did last time, and that's why we do need to settle this with Americans.
But Kate, just on that particular point, you're absolutely right to say that the Russians have remilitarized. I mean, they're focused on moving away from scones to drones, right? And they're building all these artillery shells. Why haven't, to Liam's point, I mean, anyone thinking that this war could have been won, and lots of European leaders have been saying this, but they've not put their economies on a war footing. Why are we not on a war footing? If this is so existential to the future of Europe, why is it not happening?
Because
Sorry.
Kate first and then Liam.
So, please, Kate.
I think that is, in a way, the gauntlet that Trump is putting out there, which is very uncomfortable for us. But he is basically saying, you've got to spend more on, you've got to pay the price for peace. Now, not everyone wants to hear that, and not everyone's ready for that, because we haven't had that sort of thrown at us in the West for a long time. But that is what he's basically saying.
Liam.
Because Western European leaders weren't prepared to have our troops, if you like, on the ground during the conflict. Our Prime Minister has said that the UK troops could contribute, as long as everyone else contributes, to a peacekeeping operation in a kind of grey buffer zone, if you like, between Russia and Ukraine. But the Trump administration have made clear there won't be American troops on the ground in that peacekeeping force, and that gives the European governments the perfect get-out to then not commit troops, because they know the reality is, for better or for worse, that a lot of voters in the Western world wouldn't want to see troops on the ground, whether they're in terms of conflict or in terms of peacekeeping. That just is the reality, and Western politicians have not done a good job at all of trying to change that reality.